The blood-red sunset stretched across the sky as Jackson Davidson stared blankly at the fresh grave marker, its wooden surface still rough and new against the backdrop of swaying prairie grass. 3 months had passed since typhoid fever had taken his wife Sarah, but the wound felt as raw as the day he'd watched her slip away, leaving him alone with 3 children and a ranch that suddenly seemed too empty to bear. Wood River, Nebraska, 1878, was unforgiving to a man without a wife. The harsh spring winds whipped across the open plain as Jackson knelt beside the grave, his calloused hands placing a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered on his ride over from their homestead. "Pa!" the small voice broke through his thoughts. Jackson turned to see his 10-year-old son Thomas standing awkwardly by their wagon, shifting from one foot to another. Behind him, 6-year-old Abigail clutched her rag doll, thumb in mouth, while 2-year-old Benjamin slept in the wagon bed, mercifully unaware of the enormity of their loss. "Coming, son," Jackson said, his voice rough from disuse. He rose to his full height, dusting the Nebraska soil from his knees. At 32, Jackson had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life under the prairie sun, though the new creases around his eyes weren't from squinting at the horizon, but from nights spent crying when the children couldn't hear. The ride back to their homestead was silent save for the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snuffle from little Benjamin. Their modest ranch sat on the outskirts of Wood River, a small but growing town along the Union Pacific Railroad line. Once, the sight of their whitewashed house had filled Jackson with pride. Now it was just another reminder of Sarah's absence. Thomas helped his father with the horses while Abigail took Benjamin inside. Jackson had been trying his best to keep things running, but the truth was painfully clear he was failing. The house was in disarray. Meals were haphazard affairs of whatever could be thrown together quickly, and the children's clothes needed washing and mending. That evening, after a supper of beans and cornbread that was burned on the bottom and nearly raw on top, Jackson sat at the kitchen table, head in hands, when a knock came at the door. "Evening, Jackson," Frances Blackburn said when he opened the door. At 27, Frances was the schoolteacher who had come to Wood River 2 years earlier. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned up, and her simple blue dress was a stark contrast to Jackson's rumpled appearance. "Miss Blackburn," he nodded, suddenly aware of his disheveled state. "I've brought some stew," she said, holding up a covered pot. "And I thought perhaps I might help with the children's lessons. Thomas has been missing school and I worry about him falling behind." Jackson stepped back, allowing her to enter. "That's kind of you, but we're managing." Frances looked around the cluttered room, taking in the unwashed dishes, the pile of mending in the corner, and the general disarray that had become their daily existence. Her eyes softened, not with pity but with understanding. "Jackson," she said quietly, setting the pot on the table, "your children still need a mother now." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he nearly staggered backward. "Sarah's been gone 3 months," he said, voice tight. "I'm not suggesting," Frances began, her cheeks coloring. "I only meant they need someone to look after them while you grieve and work the ranch. I could help a few hours each day." Jackson wanted to refuse, to insist they could manage, but Thomas had appeared in the doorway, eyes brightening at the sight of his teacher. "Miss Blackburn, did you bring more books?" The boy's enthusiasm was the first sign of life Jackson had seen in him for weeks. Frances smiled, reaching into her bag to produce a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. "I thought you might enjoy this one, Thomas." As Thomas eagerly took the book, Frances turned back to Jackson. "Consider it, Mr. Davidson, for the children." That night, after the children were asleep, Jackson sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the vast Nebraska prairie. Sarah had loved these quiet evenings, often sitting beside him, her hand in his, planning their future. Now that future had been ripped away, leaving him adrift in a life he no longer recognized. Frances's words echoed in his mind. "Your children still need a mother now." The thought of anyone taking Sarah's place brought a fresh wave of pain, but he couldn't deny the truth of Frances's observation. The children were suffering, not just from the loss of their mother, but from his inadequate attempts to fill the void she'd left. The next morning, Jackson made a decision. After getting the children up and feeding them a breakfast of oatmeal that was only slightly burned, he hitched up the wagon. "We're going to town," he announced, helping little Benjamin into his coat. The teacher's cottage sat behind the schoolhouse, a modest structure that reflected Frances's practical nature. When she answered his knock, she seemed surprised to see him and the children standing there in their Sunday best, such as it was. "Mr. Davidson," she said, opening the door wider. "Please come in." The cottage was small but meticulously kept, with books lining every available shelf and a vase of wildflowers on the table. "Miss Blackburn," Jackson began, hat in hand, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the children needing help." He couldn't bring himself to say "mother" again. "If your offer still stands, we'd be grateful for any assistance you might provide." Frances's smile was warm as she looked from Jackson to the children. "Of course it stands. I can come by after school each day, help with lessons, cooking, and whatever else is needed." And so began a new routine. Frances would arrive at the Davidson homestead each afternoon, bringing order to chaos with a gentle efficiency that reminded Jackson painfully of Sarah, yet was distinctly her own. She taught Thomas his lessons, showed Abigail how to tend the kitchen garden, and sang Benjamin to sleep with lullabies in a voice that was clear and sweet. For the first few weeks, Jackson kept his distance, spending long hours in the fields or with the livestock, coming in only when necessary. The pain of seeing another woman in Sarah's kitchen, caring for Sarah's children, was too acute to bear. But as spring gave way to summer, he found himself lingering, watching Frances from the corner of his eye as she moved through their home with quiet confidence. One evening, as Frances prepared to leave after putting the children to bed, a sudden thunderstorm broke over the prairie. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. "You can't ride back to town in this," Jackson said, looking out at the darkening sky crisscrossed with lightning. "Stay the night. You can have my room, I'll sleep in the barn." Frances hesitated, conscious of appearances, but the crack of thunder that shook the house made the decision for her. "Thank you, but I couldn't take your bed." "You'll take it," Jackson said firmly, in a tone that brooked no argument. I'll not have it said that Jackson Davidson sent a woman out in a storm or made her sleep on a hard floor. That night, as Jackson lay on a makeshift bed in the hayloft, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, he found himself thinking not of Sarah, as he usually did in these quiet moments, but of Frances. Of the way she'd looked at supper, laughing at something Thomas had said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Of how she'd bent to kiss Benjamin's forehead before tucking him in, with a tenderness that made Jackson's chest ache. The thought brought a wave of guilt so strong it nearly choked him. To think of another woman seemed a betrayal of Sarah's memory, of the love they had shared for 11 years. He rolled onto his side, pulling the rough blanket tighter around him, determined to banish such thoughts. But they returned the next morning when he entered the kitchen to find Frances already up, her hair loose around her shoulders as she cooked breakfast. She turned at his entrance, a smile starting to form before she noticed his expression. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I thought I'd make breakfast before heading back to town. "No need to apologize," Jackson said gruffly, moving to the stove to pour himself coffee. "It's nice." The admission seemed to surprise them both. Frances looked down, focusing intently on the eggs in the pan. "The storm's passed. I should get back before school starts." Jackson nodded, watching as she quickly pinned up her hair and gathered her things. There was an awkwardness between them that hadn't been there before, a tension he didn't fully understand or want to acknowledge. As summer progressed, Frances became a fixture at the Davidson homestead. The children bloomed under her care, regaining some of the joy that had been absent since their mother's death. Even little Benjamin, who had been too young to understand what had happened, seemed more settled, running to the door each afternoon when he heard Frances's horse approaching. Jackson found himself looking forward to her visits as well, though he tried to hide it. He would watch her from the fields, the way she hung laundry on the line or sat under the old oak tree reading to the children. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, he would catch himself smiling at the sound of her laughter drifting across the yard. One hot July afternoon, Jackson returned from town to find Frances and the children at the creek that ran along the edge of their property. They had spread a quilt on the grassy bank, and Frances was teaching them to make daisy chains while their feet dangled in the cool water. The scene struck him with such force that he had to stop, one hand gripping the saddle horn as emotion washed over him. It was a picture of family, of what they had lost and what, perhaps, they could have again. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jackson found Frances on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. "Thank you," he said simply, coming to stand beside her. She glanced at him, surprise evident in her features. "For what?" "For bringing life back into this home, for helping me remember what it's like to." He trailed off, uncertain how to express the gradual lightening he'd felt in his heart over these past months. Frances was quiet for a long moment. "They're wonderful children, Jackson. It's been a privilege to know them, to know all of you." There was something in her voice that made him turn to look at her fully. The moonlight softened her features, catching in her auburn hair and illuminating the curve of her cheek. "Frances," he began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw understanding, patience, and something else, something that both terrified and exhilarated him. "It's all right," she said softly. "I know you're not ready. I don't expect anything, Jackson." He nodded, grateful for her perception. "Good night, Frances." "Good night, Jackson." As she rode away, Jackson remained on the porch, his thoughts in turmoil. The guilt he'd been carrying began to shift, not disappearing but transforming into something else, a recognition that life continued, that hearts could heal and even, perhaps, love again. The following Sunday, Jackson took the children to church, something they had done only sporadically since Sarah's death. Frances was there, sitting with some of her students, and her face brightened when she saw them. After the service, as the congregation mingled outside in the summer sunshine, several of the town's women approached Jackson. Mr. Davidson, Mrs. Miller, the butcher's wife, said with a meaningful glance toward Frances, "We've all noticed how much time Miss Blackburn's been spending at your place. People are starting to talk." Jackson stiffened. "Miss Blackburn has been kind enough to help with the children. There's nothing improper about it." Mrs. Miller raised an eyebrow. "A single woman spending hours alone with a widower. Maybe not improper yet, but it's certainly headed that way in folks' minds." Before Jackson could respond, Frances appeared at his side, having overheard the exchange. "Mrs. Miller," she said coolly, "I appreciate your concern for propriety, but I assure you my interest is solely in the welfare of the children." The older woman looked between them, clearly unconvinced. "All the same, Miss Blackburn, you might consider your reputation. A schoolteacher must be above reproach. As Mrs. Miller walked away, Frances's composure slipped, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her bonnet. "I'm sorry," Jackson said quietly. "I never meant to cause you any trouble." "You haven't," Frances replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "People will always talk." But the damage had been done. That evening, when Frances came to the homestead, there was a restraint in her manner that hadn't been there before. She kept the children close, avoiding being alone with Jackson, and left earlier than usual. The pattern continued for several days, a new formality replacing the easy companionship they had developed. Jackson found himself missing their evening conversations on the porch, the quiet moments of connection that had become a balm to his grieving heart. By the end of the week, he couldn't bear it any longer. After the children were asleep, he confronted her as she prepared to leave. "Frances, wait," he said, catching her arm gently as she reached for her coat. "We can't go on like this." She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Like what? This distance between us, the way you're pulling away." Frances sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Jackson, Mrs. Miller was right. People are talking, and it could affect my position at the school. The board is very particular about the moral character of their teachers. So we just let town gossip dictate our lives." Jackson's frustration was evident in his voice. "It's not just gossip," Frances said quietly. "It's reality. I'm a single woman spending time alone with a widower. In a small town like Wood River, that's enough to ruin a reputation." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small kitchen. "Then what do we do? The children need you." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Frances looked at him, something flaring in her eyes before she quickly looked away. "Perhaps I should just come when others are around, or maybe one of the older girls from town could help instead." The thought of Frances stepping back from their lives sent a spike of panic through Jackson's chest. "No," he said firmly. "There has to be another way." They stood in silence, the ticking of the mantel clock loud in the quiet kitchen. Finally, Jackson spoke, his voice low and uncertain. What if there was no impropriety to speak of? What if you weren't just helping a widower and his children?" Frances's eyes widened as she understood his meaning. "Jackson, are you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what I'm saying, except that the thought of you not being here." He gestured helplessly. "The children adore you, and I've come to depend on you more than I should." Frances studied him, her expression a mixture of hope and caution. "That's not enough reason to consider what you're suggesting." "I know," Jackson said, moving closer to her. "And I'm not proposing not yet. I'm just asking if you might consider the possibility. Someday." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing despite their best intentions. "I need time," Frances said finally. "And so do you, Jackson. Sarah's only been gone 6 months. He nodded, knowing she was right but unable to deny the pull he felt toward her. "Will you still come, help with the children?" "Yes," she said softly, "but perhaps not every day, and not so late." As Frances rode away that night, Jackson felt both relief and a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking toward the future with something other than dread. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to their interactions. Frances still came to help with the children, but now they were often joined by neighbors or took their outings to more public places, picnics by the river where other families gathered, trips to town for supplies, Sunday socials after church. Under the watchful eyes of Wood River, their relationship remained proper, but something was blossoming between them nonetheless. It was in the way Jackson's hand would brush Frances's when passing the salt at dinner, in the glances they exchanged over the children's heads, in the conversations that grew deeper and more personal as summer turned to fall. One crisp October afternoon, Jackson rode into town, leaving the children with Mrs. Johnson, a neighbor who had become a regular visitor since the gossip began. He found Frances at the schoolhouse, grading papers at her desk as the last of her students filed out. "Jackson," she said, surprised to see him, "is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he assured her, removing his hat as he entered the empty classroom. "I wanted to speak with you alone." Frances set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" Jackson took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. "I've been thinking about what you said that day you first came to our home, about the children needing a mother." Frances's expression softened. "They're doing much better now. You've done a wonderful job with them, Jackson." "Not without your help," he said, moving closer to her desk. "Frances, I know it's only been 8 months since Sarah died. I know some might think it's too soon. But life out here, it doesn't wait for grief to pass." He paused, gathering his courage. "The truth is, I've come to care for you. More than I thought possible." Frances stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Jackson, I'm not asking for an answer today," he said quickly. "I'm just asking you to consider it, to consider us. The children love you, and I think I could love you too, given time." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, Frances spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've come to care for you as well, Jackson, and for Thomas, Abigail, and Benjamin, but this isn't something to decide lightly." "I know," he agreed. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." As he turned to leave, Frances called after him, "Jackson." He looked back to see her smiling, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you for asking." The ride home was both the longest and shortest of Jackson's life, his mind racing with possibilities, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Over the next few weeks, a new tenderness developed between them. Frances began joining them for Sunday dinner after church, staying to read to the children in the afternoon. Sometimes, when the little ones were occupied, she and Jackson would walk the property, talking of their pasts, their hopes, the life they might build together. Jackson told her of how he'd met Sarah when they were both 18, of their journey west from Pennsylvania, of the hard early years on the homestead. Frances shared stories of her childhood in Ohio, her decision to become a teacher, the 2-week stagecoach journey that had brought her to Nebraska. As they walked one golden afternoon, the trees ablaze with autumn colors, Jackson stopped beneath a towering cottonwood. "Sarah and I planted this tree the year we settled here," he said, laying a hand on the rough bark. "She said every home needed a shade tree where children could play." Frances was quiet, respecting the memory. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Jackson agreed. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said if anything happened to her." He faltered, then continued, "She made me promise to find someone who would love the children as she did." Frances took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "She'll always be their mother, Jackson." "Nothing can change that, I know," he said, turning to face her fully. "But they need someone now, too. We all do." The weeks passed, and as winter approached, Jackson knew it was time to ask Frances properly. He arranged for the children to stay with the Johnsons one evening and invited Frances to dinner at the homestead. When she arrived, she found the house transformed. Jackson had cleaned every surface, laid out their best tablecloth, and even placed wildflowers, the last of the season, in a jar on the table. He had attempted a proper meal: roast chicken, potatoes, and bread he'd purchased from the baker in town. "Jackson," Frances said, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "What's all this?" "Dinner," he said simply, pulling out a chair for her. "Just the two of us." The meal wasn't perfect. The chicken was a bit dry, the potatoes underdone in places, but Frances pronounced it delicious. and the genuine pleasure in her eyes made any culinary shortcomings insignificant. After dinner, they sat before the fire, the crackling flames the only sound in the cozy room. "Frances," Jackson began, turning to face her, "these past months you've brought life back to this house to all of us. I can't imagine our future without you in it." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "I'm not asking you to replace Sarah. No one could. But I am asking if you might consider making a new life with us with me." From the pouch, he produced a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "Sarah's rings are put away for Abigail when she's grown." Frances's eyes filled with tears as she looked from the ring to Jackson's face. "Are you certain, Jackson? This isn't just for the children." "It started that way," he admitted. "But not anymore. I care for you, Frances, deeply. And I believe with time that care could grow into something more." Frances held his gaze, searching his face. "I care for you too, Jackson, and I love Thomas, Abigail, and Benjamin as if they were my own." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on her lips there first. It was brief, but held the promise of a deeper connection to come. They decided to marry before Christmas, giving the town time to adjust to the news and allowing Frances to finish the school term. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some congratulated them sincerely. Others whispered about the hasty courtship. But as the weeks passed, and they were seen together at church and town gatherings, even the most skeptical began to soften at the evident affection between them. The children's responses varied. Thomas, at 10, was old enough to understand and seemed relieved that their makeshift household would become permanent. "Does this mean you'll be our mother now?" he asked Frances one evening as she helped him with his arithmetic. "I'll be your stepmother," Frances corrected gently. "Your mother will always be your mother, Thomas, but I'll love you and care for you just as she would want." The boy nodded, considering this. "I think that's all right then." Abigail was more hesitant, clinging to her father and watching Frances with wary eyes. "But what about Mama?" she asked Jackson one night as he tucked her into bed. "Mama is in heaven, sweetheart," he explained, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "She can't be here with us anymore, but Miss Frances loves you very much and she wants to help take care of you. Will you still love Mama?" The little girl pressed. Jackson's throat tightened. "Always, Abby, always." Benjamin, at nearly 3, was the most accepting, already calling Frances Mama to everyone's surprise. The first time it happened, at supper one evening, a heavy silence fell over the table. Frances looked stricken, while Jackson seemed unsure whether to correct the toddler. "Benjamin," Frances said carefully, "you can call me Frances." But the little boy shook his head stubbornly. "Mama," he insisted, reaching for her to help him with his milk. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Frances and Jackson sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the November chill. "I'm sorry about Benjamin," Jackson said. "I can talk to him." "No," Frances interrupted. "Don't. He's too young to understand, and it clearly feels natural to him." She hesitated. "Unless it bothers you." Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "It did at first," he admitted. "But then I realized Sarah would want him to have a mother he could remember, not just stories of someone he'll never know." He reached for Frances's hand, squeezing it gently. "If you're comfortable with it, I am too." The wedding was set for December 22nd. A small affair at the church, followed by a gathering at the Davidson homestead. As the day approached, Frances moved her belongings from the teacher's cottage to the ranch, though she would stay with a friend in town until after the ceremony, in deference to propriety. On the morning of the wedding, snow began to fall, large flakes drifting lazily from a pearl gray sky. Jackson stood at the window of the ranch house, watching the landscape transform, thinking of how his life had changed in the past year, the devastating loss, the struggle to continue, and now this unexpected second chance at happiness. Thomas entered the room, already dressed in his Sunday best. "Pa, it's time to go," he said, his young face serious with the responsibility of being his father's best man. The church was filled with the people of Wood River, the pews decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbon. As Jackson stood at the altar with Thomas beside him, Abigail and Benjamin sitting with Mrs. Johnson in the front row, the organ began to play. Frances appeared at the back of the church, a vision in a simple dress of deep blue velvet, her auburn hair arranged in soft curls beneath a small hat adorned with winter berries. She carried a bouquet of pine and holly, bright spots of color against the winter palette. As she walked toward him, Jackson felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. When she reached his side, he took her hand, feeling its slight tremor beneath his touch. The ceremony was brief, the traditional vows exchanged with clear voices despite the emotion evident on both their faces. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Frances with gentle reverence, sealing their promise before God and community. The celebration afterward was warm and joyful, the homestead filled with neighbors bearing food and good wishes. The children stayed close to the newlyweds, Benjamin perched on Frances's lap for much of the afternoon, Abigail gradually warming to the idea of having a stepmother as she saw how happy her father looked. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Jackson and Frances found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife, the children already asleep in their beds. "Mrs. Davidson," Jackson said, drawing her into his arms. Frances smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "It sounds strange but wonderful. Are you happy?" he asked, suddenly uncertain despite the day's joy. "Very," she assured him, resting her head against his chest. "It won't always be easy, I know that, but we'll face it together." That night, as they lay together in what was now their bed, Jackson felt the last of his guilt begin to fade. Sarah would always hold a place in his heart, but there was room there for Frances too, a different love, but no less real for being unexpected. The winter passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Frances learned the rhythms of the ranch, managing the household with the same efficiency she'd shown in the classroom. Jackson found himself smiling more, laughing with the children, making plans for the future again. There were difficult moments, Abigail's tears on Sarah's birthday, Thomas's occasional withdrawal when memories became too sharp, the first time Frances rearranged some of Sarah's things to make room for her own. But through it all, they talked openly, acknowledging the pain while building something new alongside it. By spring, Frances had become a true mother to the children and a partner to Jackson in every sense. The ranch was thriving under their joint care, and there was talk of expanding the herd come summer. Frances had continued teaching, riding to the schoolhouse each morning and returning home each afternoon to a family that awaited her eagerly. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Frances turned to Jackson with a soft smile. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Jackson stared at her in wonder, joy spreading across his features. "A baby," he repeated, pulling her into his arms. "Oh, Frances," they told the children the next day, watching their reactions carefully. Thomas looked surprised but pleased, Abigail uncertain until Frances assured her that the new baby wouldn't mean less love for any of them. Benjamin simply patted Frances's still flat stomach and announced, "Baby," with great authority. As summer arrived, bringing with it the promise of new life, Jackson often found himself standing beneath the cottonwood tree, thinking of the journey that had brought them here. He had never expected to love again after Sarah, never thought his broken heart could heal enough to let someone else in. But watching Frances now, her belly beginning to round with their child as she moved through their home with quiet grace, he knew he had been given a rare gift, a second chance at family, at love, at life itself. The baby came in late November, on a night when the first snow of winter dusted the prairie. Jackson paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Frances's labor pains with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, while Mrs. Johnson, now their trusted friend, attended the birth. Thomas sat with his siblings at the kitchen table, trying to distract them with a game of checkers, though his own worry was evident in his frequent glances toward the stairs. When the cry of a newborn finally pierced the night, Jackson's heart leaped. Minutes later, Mrs. Johnson opened the door, her face weary but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Davidson," she announced, "and your wife is doing fine." Jackson entered the bedroom to find Frances propped up against the pillows, her face flushed but radiant as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Jackson sat carefully on the edge of the bed, taking in the tiny face with its shock of dark hair and tightly closed eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "What shall we call him?" Frances asked, leaning against Jackson's shoulder. Jackson thought for a moment. "How about William, after your father?" Frances's eyes filled with fresh tears. "William Davidson," she said, testing the name. "I love it." The children were allowed in briefly to meet their new brother, Abigail and Benjamin wide-eyed with wonder while Thomas tried to maintain a dignified interest befitting his 11 years. "He's so small," Abigail whispered, peering at the baby. "You were that small once too," Jackson told her, pulling her into a one-armed embrace. As the children filed out to let Frances rest, Thomas lingered, looking thoughtful. "Pa," he said hesitantly, "do you think my first mama would be happy about William?" Jackson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, son, I do. Your mother loved babies, and she'd be glad to know you all have Frances to love you now." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's all right to love them both, you know, just like I do." Thomas nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. "I think I do too," he admitted before following his siblings downstairs. That night, as Frances and William slept beside him, Jackson reflected on the journey of the past 2 years, from devastating loss to unexpected joy. From grief so deep, he thought he might drown in it, to love that had saved him when he least expected it. Frances stirred, opening her eyes to find him watching her. "What are you thinking about?" she murmured sleepily. "About how lucky I am," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "How grateful," she smiled, understanding in her eyes. "We all are, Jackson, for each other." As William grew from infant to toddler, the Davidson family settled into a rhythm of ranch life that encompassed both past and present. Sarah's memory was honored, her birthday marked with flowers on her grave, stories of her shared with the children. Her handmade quilt still draped across the back of the sofa, but Frances's presence was no longer shadowed by comparison or guilt. By William's first birthday, the ranch had expanded, with new pasture land purchased and the herd nearly doubled. Frances continued to teach, bringing William with her to the schoolhouse, where he became a favorite among her students. Thomas, now 12, was showing a keen interest in ranching, while Abigail at 8 had developed her stepmother's love of books. Benjamin at 4 was a bundle of energy, following his father everywhere and already insisting he was old enough to help with the horses. On a warm summer evening in 1881, 3 years after their wedding, Jackson and Frances sat on the porch swing, watching the children play beneath the cottonwood tree. William toddled after his siblings, his chubby legs carrying him with determined if unsteady steps. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked suddenly, his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. "Marrying a widower with 3 children, taking on all of this when you could have had a simpler life." Frances turned to him, surprise evident in her expression. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." She took his hand, linking their fingers together. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be, Jackson. With you, with our children. Our children." The phrase still filled Jackson with a sense of wonder and gratitude. Frances had never distinguished between the children she had birthed and those she had inherited, loving them all with equal devotion. "I love you, Frances Davidson," he said, leaning in to kiss her softly. "And I love you," she replied. "Always." As the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the Davidson family gathered on the porch steps. Thomas, lanky and growing into a young man, sat with his arm around Abigail. Benjamin perched on his father's knee, while William nestled against his mother's chest, his eyes heavy with sleep. Frances began to sing, her clear voice carrying across the twilight an old lullaby she had taught the children, one that now belonged to their family alone. One by one, the children joined in, even Thomas with his changing voice, creating a harmony that seemed to embrace the homestead in warmth and belonging. Jackson listened, his heart full to bursting, knowing that this moment, this family, this love was the greatest blessing a man could receive. From the depths of grief had come joy beyond measure, a second chance he had never sought but would be eternally grateful for. As the last notes of the song faded into the gathering darkness, Jackson looked up at the first stars appearing in the velvet sky. Somewhere, he liked to think, Sarah was watching over them, approving of the family they had become. "Your children still need a mother now," Frances had said that day, so long ago. She had been right, but what none of them had known then was how much he had needed her too, not just as a mother for his children, but as a partner to walk beside him through all the days to come. And as the years passed, their love only deepened, weathering the storms of life on the prairie with the strength that comes from choosing each other anew each day. The Davidson Ranch became known throughout Wood River as a place of warmth and welcome, their door always open to neighbors in need, their table often surrounded by friends and family. William was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and the family was complete. 5 children, 2 parents, and a legacy of love that had been forged in the crucible of loss and reborn in the courage to begin again. In the years to come, when people in Wood River spoke of Jackson and Frances Davidson, they would tell a story of hope of a grieving cowboy who thought his heart had died with his wife, and the schoolteacher who gently showed him that love, once learned, is never truly forgotten. That hearts, like the Nebraska prairie after a harsh winter, can bloom again with unexpected beauty when the right season comes. And bloom they did, through all the seasons of their lives together, 2 souls who had found each other when they needed it most, creating from separate paths a single journey walked hand in hand until the end of their days.